So what did the Spaniards find when they arrived? Well, when they arrived, they found that there were all kinds of tribes and chiefdoms occupying Argentina and Brazil and the whole Rio de la Plata estuary, as it's called. It's also called the Mesopotamian region if you're in Argentina, because it resembles to them so much the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley area of Iraq. And of course, without all the contemporary warfare. But at any rate, what we're going to have to do, therefore, is kind of jump up to what Argentina looks like today. Well, beginning with the Spanish occupation, we see a beginning of change of the racial makeup of the people of Argentina. And in your book, you're going to see that there's a discussion of this for every area of Argentina, and you'll see that the differences between the Native American genetic code and those of the Spanish and Africans and others that came in there are now pretty well understood. But in the Buenos Aires, Entre Rios area, which is northwest Argentina, but they're called the Central Provinces, there is an overwhelming concentration of Europeans. Well, where did they come from? Mostly they came from Spain and Italy, and they came late. Now we're going to get to that in just a minute, but what I mean by late is after 1880. And the reason they went there was not like the Irish fleeing Ireland because of the famine and going over to Boston and trying to make something out of themselves there. These people came from Italy and Spain because wages were so high in Argentina. By 1905, they were as high in Argentina as they were anywhere in Europe, and almost as high, about 80% as high as those wages being paid in the United States. So this was tremendously attractive. These were people who were already trained as industrial workers, and they had two ideological trends. One was the original anarchist trend, and then they had the Marxist trend. So they were people that were politically literate and were used to a relatively high standard of living, and were going to duplicate it in Argentina, and they did. Now, as in North America, when workers would get burned out in those factories, they had the Wild West beckoning to them. They could go give capitalist farming a try. And of course that shoved huge numbers of white workers out of the northern cities in North America and toward the West, which we've discussed before and discussed several times in your textbook. Same thing happened in Argentina. Worker gets burned out for working in a meat packing factory. When I say burned out, I'm saying these guys are working at least 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. And that can get kind of old after a while. So you might say, I think I'm going to pack up the family and head out to the Pampas region and see if I can start a farm or maybe a cattle ranch and just change your way of life completely. So that was always a safety valve there, as it was in North America for the big cities. Enough said about that particular topic. Now, the first Spanish that saw Argentina came after the Portuguese voyage of Amerigo Vespucci and Goncalo Coelho. A guy named Lisboa, another one named Flores, discovered the Rio de la Plata, and they started to explore it. Along the way, they contacted the Charrua people, who told them about the Inca Empire. So, somewhere around 1512, Spanish and Portuguese both became aware of the existence of an empire like that of the Aztecs in terms of size. These were the rumors that made it back to Panama. If you were down there in Argentina on a Spanish ship or a Portuguese ship, you might eventually end up in Panama, especially if it was Spanish. So then the word started to spread up there. Pizarro heard about this Inca Empire. By the time he got to Panama, Cortez had conquered Mexico. So now he wants to do the same thing, and we already discussed that story when we went over Peru and Bolivia. But I'll just put you in contact with the fact that this word about the Incas may have first gotten to Panama from these Portuguese explorers and the Spanish who made it up the Rio de la Plata River contacted all the peoples along the way and started to engage them in various kinds of trade. The usual kinds of trade where Europeans would give you some glass beads and you'd give them a bag of gold or whatever it was they were looking at for. So at any rate, by 1536, the city of Buenos Aires was founded. And then the Indians attacked them, pushed them out. They were gone until it was refounded in 1541. No, I'm sorry, 1580. And they got pushed out in 1541. In 1580, they came back and refounded Buenos Aires, and it has been consistently occupied and a growing city since that time. Well, the Viceroyalty of Peru by 1580 was doing very well, and a lot of people, however, in Lima, a lot of the white settlers there had not come in time to take part in everything which had happened after Pizarro conquered the Incas, and they were looking for a better place than Lima, and so there was a lot of movement of whites out of the Peruvian part of the Viceroyalty to Buenos Aires. So we began to see migration of Spaniards from other parts of the New World into Argentina. The other thing you want to take a look at when you're looking at the early history of capitalism in Argentina is the same kind of problem existed for these guys that wanted to be businessmen producing something, or even farmers and cattlemen that wanted to be able to sell their product on the international market to anybody that would buy. Was that Spanish colonial policy was the same as the British. That is, it was illegal to trade with anybody but the home country. So that was the beginning then of that kind of struggle between the native bourgeoisie in the New World and those that claimed political control over them. By 1776, the same time as the Americans had declared their independence, we see that the Spanish were beginning to do the New World Spanish, the Creoles, were beginning to look at the peninsulars in the same way that the North Americans were looking at the British. And that was as an enemy, somebody they were going to have to defeat if they wanted to develop their own businesses and engage in the world market, free of all of these mercantilist controls, which was characteristic of the early phases of capitalism. Now, Buenos Aires was particularly important in this particular time because it was the duty point for all trade in the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, which was now, I've skipped over quite a bit of material here because I don't think it's of that great an interest to you. If you want to know what happened in Argentina in those centuries prior to 1880, say, it's all in your book and you go through that. But I'm going to kind of skip up to this part where we're looking at the history of Buenos Aires in particular. Why? Well, because, as you can see from a few comments I've already made, this is not a backward part of the world. To the degree that we might accept the idea of three worlds, the first world capitalist, second world socialist, third world colonial and semi-colonial dependencies, Argentina by 1880 had moved out of this third world status, and it had a living standard and a gross domestic product almost as high as that of Europe and half of that of the United States, so that was substantial. So this was a modern industrial center in every sense of the word, but it was so far away from Europe and North America that I think it's safe to say that not a great many people other than specialists in the U.S. State Department or the British Foreign Office, so forth, were aware of what was going on there. Buenos Aires was the customs point. Now that's very important because British banks had set up by this time a situation where they were the only ones that could issue currency. And they did it through 5 different banks within Argentina. And in exchange for their guarantees on this currency, they were given all kinds of preferences, including control of the duties. One place where you know you can collect money from people is when they have to put those goods on ships and send them someplace. or when you're taking goods off of ships and taking it in. Those are places where you can charge customs duty and get away with it. And there's nothing that the shippers or on either end can do about it. They're going to have to pay. So it's a steady flow of cash to somebody. Now this divided Argentinian capitalist society, that is the bourgeoisie in Argentina, for nearly a century, throughout the 1800s into, say, 1910, into two classes of people. Those that wanted to federalize Argentina, meaning having some independent-like states, similar to that of the United States at that time, or a strong government that would collect all the duties. In other words, these independent states would get a cut out of what came out of the duties on the Buenos Aires port. And the other half of this bunch of bourgeoisie wanted to concentrate the capital in the government of Buenos Aires alone, and they had various justifications for that, which we'll see as we go through this particular lecture. Not the least of which is they were encumbering themselves with a big debt from British bankers, especially Barings Brothers, and they had to pay that off, and so they would say, for that reason, we're going to have to take all of these duties. So they had a viable case to make for why they wanted to do it that way. And of course, these guys out in the provinces, they didn't want to hear that crap. You know, they said, you're getting X amount of money in there and we want some of it. So they fought about this for decades. When I say fight, I mean they fought. There were armies being raised by the caudillos, that is the leaders of the provinces, against the central government. And I go through all of that in this chapter 40 when you get your book out. And you read about it. So, what changed there? Well, the most important thing that shook up all of Spanish New World was when Napoleon conquered Spain and threw out Fernando VII and put his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne in Madrid. Well, this started the civil war in Spain between those that were supporting the Bonapartists and those who were against them, who had maintained a little part of Spain under their control down in the port of Cadiz, which is in the extreme southern part of Spain, if you take a look at your map. Now, going there to help fight against the Napoleon regime were a whole group of independent bourgeois elements from South America, some of whom came from what is today Uruguay and Argentina. And this Peninsular War, however, had a dramatic effect on them. It was happening at the same time that the North Americans had won their independence. You recall in 1781, Washington had defeated the British and expelled them from the country. So by 1810, in Argentina, they wanted to do the same thing, and they had what they called the May Revolution. This now follows the defeat of the Bonapartist regime in Madrid. And when that happened, there was no longer any need for these foreign soldiers to come and help fight for the original monarchy. And they came back to Argentina and Uruguay. And they came back with these new ideas that they had picked up. The irreversible power of the Bonapartist drive across Europe had always been its ideology, backed up by the fact that it had democratized warfare with the introduction of mass armies. The French took all of these capitalist farms. France, by that time, had 4 times the population of all of the rest of Western Europe put together. So it had a huge number of people that it could put under arms, and almost all of those people had been serfs. And now they were free capitalist farmers. They had title to their own land, and if they wanted to keep it, they had to keep these Bourbons from coming back into power. So they were willing to be the cannon fodder that Napoleon needed for his war effort. Napoleon was militarily competent for his time, and he had gotten the idea of using mass numbers of French peasant soldiers to just overwhelm his opponents. Much of the time, all he had to do was to march them across the Pyrenees, or in this case, across the Alps into Italy, or up into Austria, and just the fact that you would have an army that was 5 to 10 men wide in terms of columns that stretched for miles, miles of these guys, was enough to intimidate royalist forces everywhere. And when they would finally make a fight, he would do something that they didn't expect: move quickly, surround them, strike them first with artillery, break up their formations, and then bring his huge numbers columns in there and just wipe them off the face of the map. And along with it, he brought in the Code Napoleon, which was, at the time, a revolutionary bourgeois concept that you shouldn't be able to jail a man unless without first bringing him in front of a judge. Now, up until that time, if a king wanted you in jail, he'd put you there, and you'd stay there until he decided to let you out or you died. So, to us, the idea of habeas corpus, that is, the idea that you have to put that body in front of a judge eventually to justify the fact that you've arrested him, is not a revolutionary concept, but at that time it certainly was. So these guys came back, like De la San Martin, came back to Buenos Aires with all of these ideas that they had picked up from the French revolutionaries they were fighting when they'd been in Spain. They'd also realized that the North Americans have proven that they don't need a king to govern themselves, that they can do it themselves. So when San Martin came back to Buenos Aires, he came back with a head full of revolutionary new ideas, and a revolt had already started there, led by 3 Argentinians who are, of course, famous in that country today. But they were getting beat. They were getting beat by latent royalist forces, that is, people that had not gone over to the Napoleonic group and who would now like to restore Spanish control over their country. San Martin came back with the idea, we don't need that monarchy. Let's just get rid of it. We'll govern ourselves just the way the North Americans are doing. And quickly he put order into the mess that was in Argentina at that time and expelled the Spanish from Argentina. Then he crossed, as we discussed before, we were talking Chile and Peru, he crossed over the Andes into Chile and did the same thing there when he hooked up with Bernardo O'Higgins, brought with him his Argentinian army. They pushed the Spanish out, captured the Spanish Navy that was in Chile, and they used it to transport their troops up to Lima. From there, San Martin met with Bolivar in Guayaquil, as we have discussed before. The two of them put together a final plan to expel the Spanish from all of South America, which meant defeating them in Peru, the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. And the Spanish fled from Lima and went to Ayacucho, and there they had their last fight. And there they were defeated, and they were expelled from all of South America for practical purposes. Now, the same thing now happens. San Martin goes back to Argentina and begins to develop his country the way they want to develop it. Now, the colonial economy, as we've said, had been characterized by this inability to trade with anybody but the home country. Well, what had that done in reality? Well, whenever you set up protectionist barriers, you just automatically, at the same time, set up smuggling. You can't have one without the other. You can't have smuggling if you don't have something to smuggle across, which means the minute you set up a protectionist border is the minute that you're going to have somebody who says, well, hell with that, I'll bring my stuff over there. And so now we have smuggling and black market. So all of that began to change. However, so we're skipping over the first few hundred years of Spanish occupation down there, which doesn't differ very much from the way it did in Chile or Peru in the period after liberation and before the onset of capitalism. In the period between 1500 and 1700, for example, Argentina had a bunch of regional economies, almost like different countries. You might think of the United States as it was prior to the Civil War, with different parts of the country distinct economic regions and trading among themselves as much as they are trading abroad. And so that's what happened there. But the one big difference is they didn't have any Mississippi River to connect their whole country to Argentina. So they were, unless you wanted to skip along the coast, you were pretty well stuck with having to go on a road anywhere from Buenos Aires south. And of course I think that speaks pretty much for itself. You can imagine what these roads and that transport was like. And as a consequence, these regions of Argentina began to develop somewhat independently, and that lasted until the early 1800s. Now, after 1800, Argentina developed a capitalist system that featured an interregional market with reciprocal flows of capital, labor, goods, commodities, and a rapid influx of true proletarians and petty bourgeois elements from Europe to Buenos Aires. And this provided the capitalists with an engine and a working class that needed to fuel a new kind of economic development. Activities associated with secondary exporting centers, such as the cities of Córdoba and Tucumán, prospered. And again, it was the export of meat from cattle and sheep grazing and cloth manufacture that supplied other parts of Spanish America. The colonial economy that had outlawed trade with anyone but the home country in all essentials for Buenos Aires, Tucumán, and Córdoba, and everywhere else in Argentina, was the principal block to development, and that had to go. And it did go once Argentina was liberated from Spanish rule, which we have just discussed. Now, I go through that discussion in your chapter in 31 pages. If you're interested in the details, you can. Now, there were some distinct things about Argentina as compared to other parts of Latin America. For example, only about 100,000 black African slaves were imported between in the 1600s and the 1700s. That is, in a period of 200 years. But in the same period of time, 2.5 million black African slaves in the 1700s and 1800s were brought to Brazil. And of course, you know, a large number of them were also brought to the United States. So, because we didn't have latifundios run by slave labor in Argentina, nor gold mining in Argentina run by big slave labor gangs, those black slaves that did come into Argentina were quickly transshipped to places where they could be used on plantations or in mines, as for example in Brazil, Paraguay, Chile, and Bolivia. So what you have here is a gradual admixture of the Native Americans in Argentina with the whites that are coming in there. Now in the 1800s, as I mentioned already, you have the rapid development of capitalist manufacturing in the provinces of Buenos Aires and Entre Rios, which was right next to it. And this is kind of like Detroit and Chicago. Think of it that way, on the Great Lakes. So in this case, their water connection is the Rio de la Plata estuary. And this is really significant for capitalist export because meat packing is getting to be a bigger and bigger deal. And there's a couple of aspects to this. One is it starts at a primitive level, and there isn't a year that goes by that somebody doesn't come up with a significant invention in the way in which to pack meat in a factory that requires a complete retooling of that factory. And so you have rapid innovation in the application of capitalist machinery in this Buenos Aires, Entre Rios area, and everything that goes along with that, including high wages, relatively high wages, because there's no labor pool in the country to draw upon except from this huge number of immigrants that are willing to come from Italy and Spain. People are coming also, don't forget, they're coming infected with the ideas of anarchism as well as Marxism. Okay, well, enough comment about that for the moment. Well, we've gone through the War for Independence and what San Martin confronted when he came back. He found that Castell, Belgrano, and several of their associates were in military trouble. They were being defeated by royalists. And he put an end to that in a matter of weeks, because this guy had learned modern warfare. What was then modern warfare? And he had been brought up to speed in all of the ideas of land warfare combined with naval warfare by the British, which had come in there, as you've seen in that series, Sharp's Rifles. At any rate, they got through all of that. Now, in the post-independence transition, remember I said there were these two groups of people, those that wanted to split the money that was coming out of the customs duties in Buenos Aires among all of the country's different provinces, and those that wanted to keep it just in Buenos Aires. So the first were called the Federalists, that wanted to federalize Argentina and so everybody would get a share of that duty. The others were called Unitarians. So this is not religious Unitarianism. This is but if you were in Argentina, especially at that time, and you were using the phrase Unitarian, you were not talking about religion. You're talking about the idea of a monolithic one-state country, the capital of which is Buenos Aires, and everything is going to be run out of Buenos Aires. So these two forces from 1816 until 1880 are constantly at war with each other, and they're at war fighting over the redivision of these customs duties. All at the same time, we have this indigenous development and very rapid innovation in the capitalist machinery installation in the factories. So, I've gone through a number of the statistics to show just how powerful this was, but Argentina was developing just as rapidly as Russia, and if you want it was very similar in the sense that Russia was a huge country, so that most of it was not involved in what was happening in St. Petersburg and other industrial centers. But yet, it was all part of the same country. So the same thing was happening in Argentina, a huge country. Most of it is not involved in what's going on in Buenos Aires. On the other hand, all of the economic and political action is coming out of these cities in both Russia and Argentina. So these are useful comparisons for you to take a look at. Now, there are several periods of this which are really worth looking at for the historian. The period from 1810 to 1830, a couple of decades there where a man named Rivadavia becomes very important, and he promotes unrestricted trade with Britain. And now that's important because it's the first time that the British have been able to trade legally with this part of the Spanish New World. Since they won the war against Spain with the defeat of Napoleon, they have now decided they would just take over all of Spain's overseas territories if they can. I'm not going to go through the in and out of that, because what we want to do is see how the Communist Party itself in Argentina got started. But all of that information is in your book. If you're interested, and those of you who have serious interest in Latin America should learn these details. But at any rate, what we want to take a look at is how British imperialism impacted Argentina, and of course it was eventually replaced by U.S. imperialism. The Rivadavia group decided to put forward a program in the late 1820s they called, in English, the Happy Experience. Now, imperialism, therefore, enters Argentina in this way. A group of Argentine compradors, that is, friends of foreign capitalists, in this case British capitalists, put together a policy, and the British bought into it completely and backed it up. It had 5 points. The first was a complete free trade and no protectionist policies against British imports. The second one was that there would be a central bank managed by British banks, because the Brits don't trust any of these Spaniards, and for good reason, as you might imagine. Not because they were Spaniards, but because they know that if they don't run it, there'll be one crook after another with one kind of banking scheme after another that's going to steal their money. The third point was absolute UK control over the port of Buenos Aires as the sole source of customs cash. So if you're going to be an exporter, you have to go through Buenos Aires. If you're going to be an importer, you have to go through Buenos Aires and pay your duties right there and nowhere else. Anywhere else is smuggling, which is a hanging offense. 4, only the British can exploit natural resources of Argentina. And 5, a Unitarianist national organization will be centered in Buenos Aires. In other words, a prototype of a political party with this, what today we might call neoliberal philosophy. But at any rate, after Rivadavia resigned in 1827, this Happy Experience plan came to an end. But the UK financial capitalists had already taken over Argentinian finance, and the exports of gold allowed by free trade policies depleted Argentina's national gold reserves. And this created a series of problems. Now, Rivadavia had tried to fix this problem of if you had gold in Argentina and you could get a better price for it in London, then you would ship your gold to London. That's the point. Well, they didn't want that to happen because Argentine finance is based on gold inside the country. And you can't do that if all your gold is gone. Rivadavia had set up what he called a discount bank, which would be, today would be like our Federal Reserve Bank. Both of these, I don't know if you know it or not, but the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank is not owned by the U.S. government. It's owned by private bankers. Now, so the discount bank was owned by these UK banks and not by the Argentine government, just like the North American government does not own the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. I don't know how many people are aware of that, probably more than there used to be because of the financial crisis the U.S. has been in now for so many years. But at any rate, North American bankers had been very unhappy for some time about the Brits taking over the financial establishment in Argentina. The report of the American John Murray Forbes to John Quincy Adams, 6th President of the United States in 1824, made that clear. And that was a confidential report to Adams, and he points out that Britain had the huge decisive influence in the economic power of the country of Argentina, and that it was just another attempt by Britain to impose its version of commercialism in a new imperialist way. Now you recall, this is 1 year after the Monroe Doctrine was pronounced in 1823. Now, the Monroe Doctrine had originally been intended to help, well, it had been intended for two reasons: to help the independence movements against Spain and to handle problems like this one in Argentina. And that is, keep British capitalists from taking over foreign countries in this hemisphere that we want to take over. That is, that our banks out of New York want to take over. So, there was already a severe tension with the British Empire in 1823 over the fact that they were moving into parts of the New World, especially Argentina, where Washington didn't want them. And so Forbes said in his report that the government in Buenos Aires was eager to be on good terms with Great Britain and to gain recognition of Argentina's Declaration of Independence, and that the most official institutions like the central bank or this discount bank had been willing to go under British control as a consequence. However, he also correctly interpreted Britain's hegemony over the Argentine economy as a new version of the old commercialist colonial policy of feudal Britain. The 1827 capitalist form of the old policy meant now the UK controls a de facto colony without the financial, civil, or military costs. Even the lack of an Argentine merchant fleet allowed Britain to manage the maritime trade for Argentina. In the mid-1820s, when Garcia was Minister of Finance, he led the government to borrow heavily to finance new projects and to pay off war debts. However, these loans came with oppressively usurious rates. For example, Baring Brothers gave the government in Argentina a loan of £570,000, but they listed it on their books as £1 million loan. So, like, they're charging them almost 100% interest. Furthermore, in the 1820s, the fiat peso began to lose value rapidly with respect to the gold-backed peso. So we had another crisis that was developing. The 1848 revolutions in England sent British capital all to other places. Largely it went to India, but at least almost half of it was going to Argentina. So this is, you remember the 1848 revolutions in Europe, which Karl Marx wrote about, and they began in January of 1848 in the Sicily region of Italy and moved northward until they had encompassed every major industrial capital on the continent. And over a period from 1848 to 1850. In January 1848 also, coincidentally, the Communist Manifesto was published in London by Marx and Engels. So the British capitalists, who are by now the most important group of capitalists in Europe, have decided, well, this is really dangerous. We better get our money into some more safe areas. And so, of course, they conquered India, and there they had huge numbers of people they could put to work at starvation wages at the factory bench, burn them up in a few months, and have plenty more to put in there. Well, they also invested heavily in Argentina, but here they had a little different situation because here they had to pay more money because these are workers that came from Europe and didn't come to be treated like a bunch of Indians. So the first stock exchange was created in Buenos Aires in 1848, and it continued until 1856. And then eventually it was recreated after 1856 in Buenos Aires. But the point is, when you have a stock exchange that's official and regulated to the degree of those days, then you can see that you've got some serious financial capital in your country. Who else is going to buy stocks? There's going to be some peon that's out there working for starvation wages on a cattle ranch. So the Federalists ruled Buenos Aires through 1852, and after that they had to kind of give up power. I won't go through the struggle over that, but the customs law of 1852 set trade barriers to protect products that were produced in Argentina, imposed high import tariffs on luxury goods, together with export quotas and tariffs on gold and silver. And there were some big battles fought between the contending forces over this, which I'm not going to go through except to mention the name Battle of Caseros was one of them. Despite the financial obstacles, the economy of Entre Rios, which is, as I've said, right next to Buenos Aires, had grown to a size near that of Buenos Aires. Entre Rios is a central province of Argentina located in the Mesopotamian region. It borders the provinces of Buenos Aires, Corrientes, and Santa Fe, and the nation of Uruguay in the east. In 1838, there was a new currency crisis, and the fiat peso, that is the paper money, was devalued by 34%. It devalued again in 1839 by another 60% of its value, and devalued again in 1845 by 40% more, 95% in 1851. So fiat money is going out of, as it did in Chile, as we discussed, is going out of favor in favor of gold-backed money. You can have paper money, in other words, but it has to be money that is immediately exchangeable upon demand for gold. Theoretically, that's the way the U.S. dollar is supposed to be operating, but I think most people have realized that there's nowhere near enough gold in Fort Knox to ever redeem these trillions of dollars that the U.S. has printed up and sent around the world. I don't want to get into that subject except to make a comment about what we mean by fiat money as opposed to gold-backed currency. So there was a civil war that went on inside Argentina again over these issues of currency. And I've gone through some of these administrations which came up as a consequence of that. There was there had been a new attempt in 1826 to write a constitution, leading to the designation of Rivadavia as president of Argentina. The provinces rejected the Unitarian Constitution, and Rivadavia eventually resigned, and the 1826 Constitution was repealed, and the Federalists took command. But Federalist governors of Buenos Aires province had the power of management over the international relations for the Argentine Confederation. So this was a kind of compromise. Okay, we'll have a federal system, like the Americans had under the Articles, North Americans had under the Articles of Confederation. Well, we'll have a central government which will have limited powers in terms of foreign policy and so forth, but otherwise everything is, the states are going to run their own affairs. In the case of Argentina, Buenos Aires, one thing they did not want to compromise on and would not was who was going to control duties imposed and their accounting in Buenos Aires and Entre Rios, and they insisted that that stay right there. But other than that, they were willing to decentralize all of the other powers of the country in a federal way. Well, Argentina was finally unified in the period between 1862 and 1880 under the presidency of a man named Mitre, Bartolome Mitre. He saw an economic improvement in Argentina with his programs of agricultural modernization, foreign investment from Great Britain, new railroads, new ports, and an immigration wave from Europe, which was in many ways the most important, because these are the people that are going to run the factories. And they're coming because the Argentine capitalists and their UK compradors have, or actually they're the compradors, the UK capitalists and the Argentinian compradors have no choice but to pay higher wages if they want to put workers in their factories, which they want to do. So, this immigration wave begins in 1880, and it doesn't stop. I mean, it just keeps coming. There was a final war over territory between Argentina, and Argentina joined Uruguay and Brazil against Paraguay. Now, that doesn't mean a lot to people up here, but at the time it meant a lot to people there, because Argentinians and Paraguayans had many social ties among their families and populations, and this was not a popular war among the Argentinian people. As a consequence, a new president came to power named Sarmiento in 1868. He defeated Paraguay and annexed part of its territory into Argentina. Buenos Aires owes its contemporary relative independence to Mitre's presidency because of his law of compromise, and this referred to how Buenos Aires joined the Argentine Republic. The city of Buenos Aires became the center of government, but without federalizing the city. As, for example, we have Washington, D.C., or Mexico DF, Distrito Federal, the federal district. They didn't have that in Argentina. So, instead, Buenos Aires, as a province, retained its position as the capital of the country and the one that had the right to do whatever it wanted to with regard to the duties. And it could secede from the nation if it chose to do so, according to this Mitre Constitution. A man named Sarmiento followed Mitre, continued the same policies in 1868 to 1874. But during this period of time, something really important happens, and that is the telegraph just swept across Argentina. Now, in 1874, and this is an important date, the first underwater cable was run between Argentina, between Buenos Aires and Montevideo, which is now the capital of Uruguay. So, that's important because we want to remember that in 1910, which is what, 35 years later, you're going to have a transatlantic cable built all the way from Europe, from Portugal and Spain, all the way to Buenos Aires. That's really important because it explains how Lenin's revolution got known instantly in Buenos Aires as it happened in 1917. In other words, they were getting the news by telegraph from Europe as fast as anybody in Europe was learning about it from Moscow. First of these underwater cables was laid in 1874 as part of the spread of the telegraph across all of Argentina, which, as you can see, also includes by this time a telegraph connection to Uruguay, soon with Chile, and so this country is already as advanced as the United States is with regard to communications, telegraphic communications. The telegraph not only helped tie a huge country together as it had in the USA, but also as in the USA, it had a decisive Civil War effect. Sarmiento managed to defeat all the caudillos in the rest of the country who were inherently secessionist and easily susceptible to advocates of rebellion. He also dealt with the fallout of the Triple Alliance War. This had been a bloody war. And the soldiers that died were largely white men that came out of Buenos Aires. And the dying continued even when the war was over, because there had been an outbreak of cholera and yellow fever, along with the thousands of deaths of soldiers suffering from gunshot wounds and shrapnel wounds of various kinds. So a large number of the existing white working class in Buenos Aires and Entre Rios had been killed off in that Triple Alliance War. Even more reason to bring more workers from Spain and Italy into Argentina. There was a great capitalist depression, you will recall, in 1873 in the capitalist world, meaning Europe and North America, and it also happened in Argentina. In 1874, Nicolas Avellaneda became president, and he had to deal with the economic depression left by the war and the panic of 1873. Most of these economic issues found resolution, and when new land in Argentina was opened for white capitalist farming settlements after the expansion of the national territory through the conquest of the desert. Now, that campaign was led by his war minister, Julio Argentino Roca, and this military campaign took most of the territories previously the homeland of indigenous peoples and reduced their population by genocide. The bloody dawn of capitalism had reached this far-off geographic locale of the Western Hemisphere. In other words, we have a very parallel development to what's happening in North America, here in the Argentine part of Latin America.